Okay, so we had Dan and Steve talk to us a bit about the effects of NAFTA, and now we're going to have Caroline and Lorenzo talk to us about the economic effects of NAFTA. Lorenzo is probably the foremost trade modeler of the effects of NAFTA. I may make a quick comment toward the end to give you my own estimate, and then you can see how much more went into his than I was able to do. That's number one, and Caroline is a great expert on the relationship of regional to global trade relations. So Kyle, let me turn it over to you. You can introduce everybody and take it from here.
So this session is NAFTA at 20 and Evaluation, which is an ambitious title for our speakers to address. And their talks will be principally focused on the economic effects of NAFTA. And when you think about it, you can kind of quickly identify several considerations that you'd want to assess. You'd want to know what are the effects of NAFTA on member countries, in particular, to what extent did it contribute to increases in trade? Maybe even more ambitiously, to what extent did it change welfare? Can we put numbers to that? You might also want to know what was the effect of NAFTA on non-member countries, or in particular, to what extent might there have been trade diversion that came about through NAFTA? And then a third thing that might be of interest would be what are the kind of broader effects of NAFTA on potentially on trade liberalization? Something that Caroline will talk about will be the effects on external tariffs of member countries, something that came up earlier from Carla's comments. Might regional agreements be catalyst for other rounds of negotiation multilaterally, or perhaps what we'll talk about later for other regional agreements themselves. So there's a lot of things to think about under this title, and fortunately we have two experts who can guide us through these considerations, and I guess we'll start, if it's okay, with Lorenzo Caliendo, who's coming to us from Yale.
Let me briefly say, I should have earlier, there are bios in here, so I've been kind of dispensing with that, but Kyle is one of the leading international trade thinkers and spends a lot of time on trade agreements, and is a great member of our economics department, a leader in our economics department here.
So thank you very much for the introduction, Kyle. So I'm going to do is basically talk about the economic effects of NAFTA. These results draw on a research that I have ongoing with Fernando Parro. He's an economist at the board, and the usual disclaimers apply. So what I'm going to do is basically answer three questions. Why was NAFTA different compared to any other agreement? Why is it difficult to measure the economic effects of NAFTA in general? And then quantifying the economic effect of NAFTA, I'm going to focus on tariff reductions and the effect that it had over trade flows and welfare. So why was NAFTA different? Well, some of that actually was discussed today in the morning. Michael said it actually very clearly. It was an FTA. Back then, was very rare to have FTAs. And in particular, NAFTA was different because it was between members which were at very different stages of development. In fact, what I'm showing you in the figures are the size of FTA enforced by the year 1995 in terms of share of GDP in the world. And you can see is NAFTA was the largest one when it was signed. So most of the resources in the world, this is the agreement in which had most of the resources in the world involved. Of course, each time the US signs an agreement, this would always happen. But back then, that was one of the first ones which actually this occurred. But particularly, why was it different? Also because it was an agreement between very different countries in terms of GDP per capita. The GDP per capita of Mexico had back then 4 or even 5 times smaller than the US. So what I'm having in this picture is inequality across members for different types of agreement up to that year, 1995. And you can see NAFTA was among the most unequal agreements, and in terms also of size, one of the largest size. So when you have countries which are very different in the stage of development, what do? They trade different goods. So let me show you the following in figures. So what I'm showing you there are imports, Mexico imports, from NAFTA member from the rest of the world, US imports and Canada imports, divided by different types of goods, namely final goods, which you usually think about goods for consumption, intermediate goods, which I'm going to call intermediate goods, which basically are processed materials and raw materials. So the first observation you can see is most trade happens on these processed materials, these intermediate goods. This happened before NAFTA in the year 1993. That's the first observation. Second is that this was particularly important for NAFTA. So these countries were trading between each other, importing processed materials, intermediate goods, much more than they were actually importing from the rest of the world. So this builds on this idea that Michael Wilson today said, this idea it's North America's supply chain. Yes, they were trading a lot of intermediate goods, exactly what you were actually also referring to, George. But in particular, how is it different Mexico compared to Canada and the US? Well, Mexico imported much more intermediate goods from Canada and the US than what actually Canada and the US imported from Mexico. 80% of imports from NAFTA, from Mexico, came from intermediate goods. 80% of their imports from, actually they import from Canada and the US for Mexico came on intermediate goods. But if you look at US and Canada, what did they did? They mostly imported, of course, intermediate goods, but it was a larger share of final goods. So you have a country like Mexico supplying final goods, intermediate also, of course, but final goods to US and Canada, Canada and the US supplying intermediate goods to Mexico. So the first point is bottom line number one, an assessment of the economic effect of NAFTA has to take into account two things. That these countries have very different stages of development and therefore produce different goods. And second, most of the trade, if there's going to be an economic effect, has to be via intermediate goods trade. So that's bottom line number one. Bottom line number two, and this is related basically to what Stephen actually was suggesting, it's very difficult to measure the economic effects of NAFTA. Why? Well, it's difficult to identify the NAFTA effect. So the figure that you see on the left, it's Mexico's GDP per capita over time. This is after NAFTA entered force, which was in the year 1994. 1995, what happened? Tequila crisis in Mexico, big reduction in terms of GDP per capita. As Stephen showed today, big increase in inflation, more than 40% of inflation actually increased for Mexico. Also unemployment and other issues. But over time, what also happened, dot-com bubble in the US in the year 2000, then China's joined the WTO. So many things actually happen after NAFTA, which basically in a way contaminates any possible analysis to actually identify the effects of NAFTA. But not only in terms of that sense, also in this is basically in the lines of discussion that we were having before, after NAFTA, these countries started signing more free trade agreements with many other countries. So what you see on the right-hand side is for Mexico, Canada, and the US, is a timeline of different free trade agreements that enter into force for these different countries. So you see Mexico signed more than 10 free trade agreements after NAFTA entered into force, and I'm actually stopping the year 2006, because if you continue on, actually this number will be much larger than that. So this is a challenge. How do you identify, difficult to identify the effects of NAFTA when so many other things were happening at the same time? External things that I consider, which in this country were exposed to factors not directly related to NAFTA, like the tequila crisis, the dot-com bubbles, and China's recession, accession to the WTO. And of course, after NAFTA, this country signed several free trade agreements. So what I'm going to try to do is still quantify the economic effects of NAFTA's tariff reduction. So I'm going to focus on the effect of NAFTA only in the case of tariff reduction, which actually Carla was making a point that it was the major policy of NAFTA, the tariff reduction. So, and I'm going to focus on NAFTA, not the Canadian-US free trade agreement. So, and I'm going to show you in a second tariff that I'm going to be talking about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use new developments on international economic literature. I'm going to build on academic work, on frontier work in the academia that actually tries to incorporate these channels. A, that we have multiple countries and they trade actually very different goods, intermediate goods, most of them. And B, these new methodologies allow you to isolate the pure effects of tariff changes. So I'm going to build on state-of-the-art new methodologies in international trade to basically incorporate these channels, which I believe are important for NAFTA, and try to say something about the North American Free Trade Agreement, and in particular, the effects on tariffs. That's one thing we're going to focus. Why tariffs? What you see there are applied tariffs from different countries, members across members, in the year 1993. This was before NAFTA entered into effect. What you see first, there's 6 figures. The first one on the left, the upper one, upper left corner, that's applied tariff rates from Mexico to Canada in the year 1993. As you can see, they're mostly high. They vary across sectors. So I'm showing this picture across different manufacturing sectors. And what you see, it's mostly the tariffs were high between Mexico and Canada, and what Mexico applied to the US. But if you look at the tariff that Canada and the US applied between each other by the year 1993, they were basically low. That's because the Canadian-US Free Trade Agreement was already entered into place. So this is the type of variation that I'm going to exploit, that this tariff actually went to 0 by the year 2005. So that's what we're going to do. What happens in an economy, in different economies, when all these tariffs that are different across sectors go to 0, what are the reallocation of resources across countries, trade effects and welfare effects. So what do we find? So this is these are the trade effects from NAFTA. So I'm looking at imports from NAFTA members before and after the agreement. So the figure on the left, what it shows are before the agreement, the share of total imports that Canada, for example, had from US and Mexico. So 100% will be the total imports from NAFTA members. 97% of those imports actually came from the US, while only 3% of those imports actually came from Mexico. After the change in tariff, what actually we find is, well, Canada's imports from Mexico increased by almost 60%, and imports from the US almost 9%. This results in a change in the share of your imports from these members, not so much, in fact. Okay, it was a big effect in terms of trade flows, but it didn't change the composition of who you were importing. You were mostly importing from the US. And if you look at the effect of Mexico imports, this is very pronounced. Mexico's imports increased more than 117% from Canada and 118% from the US. This is a big trade effect, by all means. But they increased it proportionally across members. So if you look at the share of imports before and after the agreement that Mexico imports from Canada and the US, the share remained constant. What you're going to see a different effect is going to be for the US. Before the agreement, US imported 1/3 of their goods from Mexico. Of the share of goods that they imported from NAFTA members, 1/3 from Mexico. After the agreement, this number went to 50%. So basically these numbers, what they are saying is the following, that after the agreement, Mexico started importing much more goods from Canada and the US. Which type of goods? Intermediate goods, as I was saying before. Intermediate goods which are used for production that eventually then allows you to export goods. That's what we're finding for the case of Mexico. Mexico, in fact, started supplying much more goods to the US after the agreement. That's how you see the dependence of Mexico's supplier of goods to the US. It was 1/3, it became 49 after the agreement. And you will see it in the case of exports. This is basically the same figures from the other side. Canada's exports after the agreement, that's because Canada was exporting intermediate goods, increased to Mexico 102% as a consequence of the tariff reductions of NAFTA. And you will see, that's exactly what you see in the graph. And if you look at Mexico's exports, to Canada, it went 57% up, but it went 108 up higher to the case of the US. So this is again the story that Mexico is importing intermediate goods from Canada and the US, processing these goods, and then exporting it back to their members, as most of them as actually final goods. And finally, the same happens for the US. US exports to Mexico increased 180% as a result of the reductions in tariffs. Let me talk slightly about welfare, which Kyle was actually saying that exactly. It's a very challenging concept. If you look at the change in real wages, what we find is that NAFTA generated real increase in real wages for all members. Mexico, Canada, and the US. Real wages increased for all members, and Mexico was the largest winner. And that's exactly what we're finding in the upper left figure. And the right left figure are actually contemplating welfare. There's a distinction between real income gains and welfare. And what you see that most of the welfare gains actually went to Mexico. US and Canada, in terms of welfare, gained little compared to actually to Mexico. But we can decompose this welfare. Where does it come from? Does it come from trade creation, the fact that you were able to create more trade? Or does it come from changes in terms of trade? Terms of trade is this concept that basically reflects in a way your purchasing power. It's how much your exporter prices, the price of the goods that you export, change relative to the price of the goods that you import. Now what happened is we're seeing that the terms of trade of Mexico and Canada actually in fact deteriorated after the agreement, but there was a lot of volume of trade, basically trade creation after the agreement. Why so? Well, this is particularly because of the intermediate goods. Mexico having access to cheaper intermediate goods makes them more productive. Being more productive, basically what it does, it actually reduces your exporter prices. So this reduction in cost for Mexico implies that the exporter price of Mexico actually went down from the fact that you have access to cheaper intermediate goods. But of course there was volume of trade created, and because of that, Mexico actually had positive welfare effects. And I think it's important to emphasize the sectorial aspect of this, and this basically relates to what Carla was saying today, the discussion about textiles. In fact, what we find is that textiles and electrical equipment were the two sectors in which more trade was created for NAFTA members. This was particularly the case for Mexico and the US. You can see it in the figures. Textiles, the trade creation in textiles was 6% for Mexico, and for the case of the US, it's more than 4%. Okay, the effects on Canada are actually slightly smaller. So, bottom line, let me summarize the results of this study. We find that NAFTA generated large trade effects, mostly because of this trade in intermediate goods, which are used as an input in production to produce other intermediate goods, and of course, final goods. Real wages increased for all NAFTA members, and we find that Mexico was the largest winner in terms of welfare for the case of NAFTA. we find that most of the benefits obtained, it's because of trade creation. And this message that by importing intermediate goods is like actually how Mexico was managed to actually export more goods. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Just for those of you who aren't aware of it, Lorenzo, I think, did a great job of giving us the bottom line results. There's a lot of technical detail that goes into this that wouldn't be not appropriate here, but is for the American Economic Review. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, Kyle, go ahead.
No, that's great. So next we have Caroline Freund.
Hi, thanks. Let me start by saying thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I find that these types of conferences, especially with the quality of people we have here, are just great for the research community because we learn so much from policymakers in terms of directing our research to really the issues that are most important for helping to promote liberalization. So it's really great. I also wanted to start by saying that I was in graduate school when NAFTA was being negotiated. And the interesting thing is how much the economic research on trade agreements, regional trade agreements or free trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, whatever name you want to give them, has changed over this time. So my first professor to talk to me about regional trade agreements was Jagdish Bhagwati. And of course, he's maybe the biggest proponent of free trade, but not of preferential trade agreements. And I think that view has really changed over the last 20 years in addition to the having seen what NAFTA has done. So what I think the multilateralists, I do have a presentation, I'm sort of waiting for it to come up here, but I can keep going on. So what the multilateralists, I think, opposed in free trade agreements was that free traders didn't like that free trade agreements were discriminatory. Free traders or multilateralists didn't like the potential for trade diversion that comes from a discriminatory trade agreement. Free traders didn't like the potential stumbling block that an agreement could form. If it was the case that because you have this agreement, you try to protect the borders around the free trade area. And multilateralists also didn't like the rules of origin that ended up cluttering the trade system, as in the case of customs unions. So the view at that time was very much sort of ambiguous on whether these were a good thing. I think now people view them much more as whatever channel is open, let's take. So that overall, these second best type considerations haven't panned out to be particularly large. So whatever channel is open is good to take. But just to go back and consider what some of the concerns were, and then I'm going to use some of the techniques that I've used with Emmanuel Ornelas, Tony Estevedordal, and a few others to evaluate trade agreements. So the main concern was trade diversion initially, sort of static welfare losses, where you might start importing more from a less efficient producer at the expense of production of a more efficient producer, in which case overall it's not going to be welfare enhancing, especially for the more efficient producer who's left out, but even for the importer who may be in a situation where if he's still importing from the outside member, the price has gone unchanged and there's a loss in tariff revenue. But what's interesting is that diversion's going to be greater if your tariffs are high or if you form an agreement with someone who's not your natural partner, who doesn't produce goods that you really purchase a lot of. But regional agreements aren't formed at random, they're formed endogenously. And so what we've seen happening is that the ones that have been truly successful, like NAFTA, are ones where they're formed with natural partners. And if tariffs are high, there's an incentive to reduce them because of the trade agreement and to reduce the potential dangers. And we've actually seen that happen. So just to really quickly go over what some people have found, the most common way to look at trade diversion is in a gravity approach, and they tend to find creation strongly dominates diversion. There are also some very specific studies of NAFTA looking at products which have been liberalized and how trade changed with members and non-members. And of course, Dan has done one of those important studies on the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and found it to be trade creating. Though Romales in 2007, and I think that's going to be important that it was 2007, he found it to be NAFTA to be trade diverting for Mexico. But that was right when tariffs had sort of gone up in Mexico after the debt crisis. And now if you redo that type of analysis, I don't think that holds anymore. But to the extent there is diversion or creation, external reduction might reduce that, and that's what I'm going to try and show in the case of Mexico, and that when natural partners form agreements, you do get creation. So in terms of the concerns, the second one is this probably more pernicious one, that over the long run, because of free trade agreements, you might not get to a more liberalized global economy, because countries may protect their new friends or the group. But there's really an economic incentive for countries to lower their external tariffs, because precisely to, as an importer, reduce any costly diversion. But there might be a political incentive to maintain external tariffs in order to protect preference margins. So one idea here is that if you have the agreement in order to have side commitments on things precisely like drugs or migration or non-economic issues, then it might be important, say, for the US to maintain preference margins with countries that it has these agreements with in order to keep the commitments on these side issues. So that would be a reason why such agreements could lead to less liberalization or a concern. There's, at this point, been a lot of analysis of this, and I would say overall no consensus, though most of the studies find that regionalism is good, that if you just look at cross-country, what's happened to tariffs over time and what's happened to preferences, they tend to both move together, though that could be broader liberalization with regional agreements still somewhat slowing that down. But when people look at very specific tariff line data, they still tend to find that for many of the agreements as well. So let me focus on NAFTA, since that's what this conference is about. So we've already seen a lot of figures, so I'll put up some more. In 2012, there's over $1 trillion in merchandise trade, up from $300 billion in 1993. An additional $123 billion in services, and the FDI position tripled to over $600 billion between the three countries. And if we look at trade shares, just to get a first picture of what might have happened from the NAFTA, and here the vertical line is of course the year of the agreement, though for Canada and US it's earlier. You actually don't see, what I think you'd be concerned about is a really steep jump up where trade just shifted completely to the partners if the agreement had been very diverting. You see some jump up, but you also see the emergence of China and other countries very clearly as the shares of imports from NAFTA members, particularly Canada and Mexico. So that's their share of each country's total imports that are coming from other NAFTA members actually has been declining in recent years, as it has for the world, which is the orange lines, because of the emergence of other countries. But their share of exports, so if you look at US's share of its total exports to Mexico and Canada, or Canada's share of exports to US and Mexico, have maintained. So it shows that side shows the agreement has really been important for them, that it's increased slightly or maintained, but you actually don't see a very large change. Now, there's a lot of other things going on here, and I think this speaks to what Lorenzo said, that with so many other things going on in the world, you can't really understand what happens from looking just at aggregate figures. Over the same period, what happened with tariffs, and this is what we see is that Canada reduced tariffs. This is the average MFN tariff. Canada reduced tariffs quite sharply over the period, as did Mexico post the mid-2000s, and the US did, but at a slower rate, although starting from a lower level to begin with. But this also speaks to, I think, John Romales' study that did find more diversion in Mexico, in part because it was, since his study was looking back and done around 2005 or so, and then published a couple years later, he was looking precisely at the period when Mexican tariffs were at their peak. So from what we've seen from the aggregate data is that trade shares did not adjust sharply to favor NAFTA. External tariffs fell, except in the short run Mexico, but the counterfactual is unclear. So what would have happened without NAFTA? How important was NAFTA in generating this picture? So what a lot of economists have done is turn to disaggregated data, which allows a more careful analysis. And at this point, we have 20 years of it. So we have 20 years of the MFN tariffs, 20 years of the preferential tariffs, since they weren't immediately reduced to zero. And what we can do is look at whether NAFTA imports at the very specific sort of product group level increased more in products where there were greater trade preferences or preference margins. And we can also look what happened to the external tariffs in those products that had the bigger margins. So when you had a bigger margin in, say, footwear, were you more likely or less likely to reduce your external tariff in footwear? When you had that big margin there, what happened to imports from NAFTA members, and how did that margin affect imports from non-members? And the advantage of this disaggregate data is that you can control for overall trends in the country, in the industry, things that were going on otherwise, as opposed to aggregate data where it's very difficult to deal with those issues. So applying these kinds of techniques to the NAFTA, what we find is I think, quite interesting. So the bottom picture on the left shows average tariffs from 1994 to 2012, though in the analysis we're actually using each year of the tariff. But just to show you, I mean, we know that Mexico's average tariff was much higher than Canada and the US, but its average margin, the difference between the external tariff and the preferential tariff was also much higher. So US and Canada had a much better deal to some extent in Mexico than Mexico had in the US and Canada from a kind of mercantilistic perspective. And then if we look at what happened with creation and diversion, what this is how much did a 1 percentage point greater margin, so the difference between what you charge the rest of the world and what you charge each other, how much additional trade did that generate between the partners? And for all countries, we get about 3%. For a one percentage point greater preference margin and very little diversion. But what's interesting, I think, is the differences between the three countries. In Mexico, there was trade creation and trade diversion, and this is in part because of the higher tariffs. While in Canada and the US, there was trade creation with the partner countries, but there was actually creation with non-members. So that margins increased trade from countries outside of the Union. And there are two potential explanations for this. One is that other preferences were being put into place at the same time through GSP, through, someone mentioned, the special agreement on Polish textiles or something. So there were these other agreements going on, and maybe they were correlated with the NAFTA margins. The other possibility, which relates a lot to Lorenzo's work, is that it had to do with supply chains. So increasing trade in these product groups with Canada and Mexico also meant you needed more very similar type goods from other countries, or this kind of round tripping. Which is much more likely to happen precisely when tariffs themselves are low, as they were in Canada and Mexico. And in the case of Canada, where we really see this trade creation happening a lot, it may also have to do with the fact that, as I'm going to show you next, that was the country where the liberalization encouraged by the NAFTA happened the most. So in terms of the first issue, trade creation and diversion, we don't really find much diversion in Mexico. And then the second big concern is, okay, but is it going to prevent us from moving forward on liberalization? So what these three charts are is they're the change in preferential tariffs over the whole period from 93 to 2012, versus the change in MFN tariffs, which is on the vertical axis. So a positive line means that when one's reduced a lot, the other's also reduced a lot over the period. And that's what you can sort of see from the pictures in most cases, that in general there certainly isn't a negative trend. And that's the kind of what we call tariff complementarity. And you can use the same types of panel estimates to look at, within a specific product, as the preference goes down, what happens next year to the MFN tariff. And again, you find this complementary relationship where preferential tariff reduction tends to encourage more MFN reduction, not less. And this was especially the case in Canada, but also is significant in the US and Mexico. So overall, a 1 percentage point increase in the preference margin tends to lead to about a 1/3 percentage point external tariff reduction, so reduction that benefits all countries, all MFN countries. So just as an overall evaluation.
So that 1/3 of a percentage point would apply to a larger cumulative volume.
Yes.
So the benefits could be as larger than just from the direct benefits, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. I tried to do some back of the envelope calculations on that, and also on it affects actually to do an aggregate creation and diversion, but I wasn't able to complete that for this conference. Okay. So as an overall evaluation, trade creation has dominated diversion, and preferences have promoted external tariff reduction in all of the NAFTA countries. So I was also asked to comment on some of the more going forward type issues, so I'll just present these slides really quickly, and maybe they can be useful for a later discussion. So I think one of the questions to the whole group is if NAFTA is so successful, why is there opposition? And we've touched on some of these reasons, but I just put some of the ones that came to my mind here. One is this sort of anti-globalization, which maybe was stronger in the past than it is now, as the supply chains and people have realized you need to be in countries and companies that compete globally for success. It's also been a period, well, currently where there's unemployment around the world is tough, wages have stagnated, outsourcing has become kind of a touchy subject, a lot of inequality. This was, as has been mentioned earlier, the first comprehensive North-South deal, and that opened up the issues of labor and the environment. There was also the proximity, the neighborhood effect, and concerns over migration and drugs, though to some extent the NAFTA should, and certainly has, it'd be interesting to see a study of what effect NAFTA has had on migration and drug trade. And then more recently, the trade deficits in the US, which have been so difficult to address over this whole period of NAFTA. The average trade deficit in the US was 3.4% of GDP. Still, liberalization is moving forward, as we know, and hopefully will help deepen the NAFTA as well. And just to put into perspective, so if we look at the size of NAFTA and compare it to what TPP would be, TPP increases it by about 75%. So in terms of both merchandise trade as well as population. And finally, what might the TPP add to NAFTA? So this goes to the question of what was missing. Freer trade, but it doesn't seem like completely free trade in agriculture. And then state-owned enterprises, coverage of government procurement, labor, the environment, expanded e-commerce, intellectual property rights, new approach to rules of origin, potentially a currency chapter, potentially cyber espionage seems to be another issue now. What's interesting too are the issues that aren't on the list, like migration, which we've talked about, and contingent protection. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. So now we can open up for questions, and I wonder if I can just jump in quickly and ask one of Lorenzo. So your welfare numbers for U.S. and Canada were small, right? And can you, which might be different than would have been expected. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's behind those numbers?
Can you also explain what you mean? I'm not in the economist in the depth you guys are. What do you mean by welfare?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Please.
As I show you, real income increase basically means wages. Wages, real wages. But I mean, welfare implies whatever we have an income, what we consume. So these are estimates that actually reflect how your purchasing power in terms of the goods that you can consume can actually go up or down. So that's what I mean by welfare. It's not only income which comes from wages, and also income which comes also from tariff revenue. So you have to adjust by the prices of the goods, of the baskets of the goods that you consume. But it's exactly what Cal was saying. First, the numbers are small in general. That's not something about this study. I think that's a challenge for the international trade literature in general. We still need to understand what are the real welfare gains from trade economy. We are able to find large trade effects from tariff reductions. In a way, I can argue large effects on real wages. But when we go back to the welfare measures, most of the studies, and that's I think a challenge for international trade literature, have found that the welfare effects are small. I think this is because some channels are missing. And I think the channels what Dan was actually pointed out. Gains in productivity, heterogeneity across firms, in terms of productivity might actually improve welfare gains in general, although there's some tension about this in the literature. And we can talk about that if you want more. But in terms of my analysis in particular, as you see, most of the tariff reductions in my analysis came from US to Mexico, Canada to Mexico, and vice versa. The tariff between Canada and the US were really small by then. So that's, I think, behind the results on welfare for Canada and the US. The small economy here is Mexico. And we do know in trade that the small economy is the one that always gains the most. So in that sense, this is where you see resistance like Ukraine, a small economy having a chance to open with a very large economy like the EU because of that. The smallest economy usually is the one that gets the most. So that's...
Yes, please.
I have a question for Calvin. I must say that I'm very happy to see that the trade diversion in NAFTA is little, because that used to be what I used to answer to the newspaper people after every single negotiation table. Isn't that an effect for the rest of the people and the academic life? People were saying that it was going to be very trade diverting. I was feeling so guilty about this that when I left government, I went to teach for a year and a bit in Princeton. I invited Carl and Michael and some other people to write a little book on trade diversion and regionalism. So we wrote a little book called Reflections on Regionalism, published by the Carnegie Foundation, I think is the name. And we realized that, of course, when we used to answer that that there was not going to be diversion, actually we were being politicians. We didn't know if there was going to be diversion or not. And then when we studied it, turns out that it's more relevant the role of the rules of origin than the role of tariffs in the analysis of trade diversion. And I'm raising this because I think your work is fantastic. I like it a lot, and how you compare MFN with preferential tariffs. But probably you should look into the issues of rules of origin, and probably you have. But the point I think that could be derived from that analysis is that the rules at the GATT, or the WTO rules, are stronger for the discipline that you have to have on your tariff, on your MFN tariff when you go into a free trade agreement, more than the distortions that you can incorporate in your agreement through the rules of origin. So I think that a very important issue, if we believe in free trade, and that these are building blocks for global trade, is to change some of the rules in the WTO, particularly Article 24. Because they do not have a condition of minimal or maximal component of rules of origin. This came from Jacob Weiner's book on custom unions. And back then, when the WTO created, the GATT created these rules, very few FTAs. Most of them were customs unions. And now it's the other way around. Customs unions are very few, and now we have FTAs that have rules of origin by definition of FTA. So introducing rules to discipline the rules of origin is crucial. In the case of NAFTA, we found that we didn't introduce too much of a diversion because of the gravity model, basically, and the history of our trade. So the contents that we ended up negotiating with Carl and Michael for rules of origin were pretty much the reflection of the history, because we were pretty integrated in that sense. So I think that you can conclude nicely that not only through tariff reduction or through the differentiation between MFN and preferential tariffs, we did not create trade diversion, but also in terms of rules of origin, That doesn't mean the rules of origin shouldn't be regulated. I believe that in the WTO they should regulate rules of origin. But I'm very glad to see the result because it makes me feel better.
Dan.
Yeah, I'd love to sort of, especially for people who aren't sort of expert in trade, and try to integrate what are really four very disparate mechanisms to think about trade, and just make sure we understand which are complementary and which are overlapping, and are we double counting here. And it's going to require quite a bit of simplification, but the core of what Lorenzo is getting, I think that's super interesting, no one has ever been able to do it before, is these inter-industry linkages. And that allows us to talk about things like supply chains. That's hugely important, and that's what's and that's what is absolutely completely novel about what he's done. In fact, I told a PhD student like 6 months ago before I read your paper that what you're doing couldn't be done. So this is the key that's novel here in terms of policy making is that we're getting at the inter-industry linkages in the way we've never been able to do before. So that's what's really the numbers that you're seeing relate to those inter-industry linkages. It's not saying that the numbers, so that's one piece of the game. And then we have, Caroline's talking about another piece, which is this trade diversion and creation, which adds additional numbers to our calculations. So we're getting more from that, though you didn't put it in welfare terms, you put it in trade terms, so we can't quite put it on the same apples with apples comparison. And we had Stephen talking about another equally important one, which is what is the impact of these agreements on the way we function as a society. He talked about democratization of Mexico, which is a whole other set of gains, and who knows how large those are. But they seem so fundamental to the way we want to think about the gains from trade. And they can spill over in ways that we haven't even begun to think about. Democratization is one of them, but with democratization comes things that George is interested in, which is an increase in the provision of public goods like K-12 education in Mexico that are underprovided precisely because of the monopoly of power in Mexico. And Latin America has a history of underprovision of educational resources. And then there's what I'm doing, which is separate, again, from all of those, and which adds on to those effects. It doesn't overlap with them. And that is just a recognition that in international trade, the vast majority of what we trade in manufactured goods and in many services, not in energy, is dominated by a very small number of mega firms, the Walmarts of the world, the General Motors of the world, the Apples of the world. And so you can't begin to think about trade unless you're thinking about the deep IO structure of how industries function. When we talk about special interest protection, that the firms themselves totally get it, right? But as economists, we fail to model that. And so what you're seeing in my work is this notion that firms behave strategically. They think about how they're going to position themselves in a market, how they're going to create value in that market, and they do take active strategies to make sure that these things actually happen. And those are yet further numbers to add on to it. So we're piling on and piling on and piling on. It's very important to understand. And then the last thing that I would say is to hook into your comments about trade diversion. The reason that you should not have been surprised about it, you start thinking strategically about what firms actually do. What should not be a surprise is it's one thing for negotiators to, I guess Harbinger would have said, fertilize the ground. You spread the manure of openness and let firms take advantage of that.
Fertilizer.
Organic fertilizer.
Deodorized fertilizer. You create the conditions. And
I think Michael is going to do something in UT.
Well, we could have a comparative advantage in fertilizer. But you create the conditions, but that doesn't mean that you bring the horse, you bring the horse to the water. It doesn't mean the horse drinks, right? It doesn't mean that firms take advantage of what you offer them. In the case of Mexico, what you offer Mexican firms is not that they could continue making, say, and this is a point that a fellow called Verhoeven makes, it's not that they could continue making Volkswagen Beetles in crummy factories that have no robotics and have no quality control and use unskilled labor for assembly. It's that you gave them demanding American consumers who weren't going to accept any of those autos. And it's those it's the type of market you offer to these firms. And it's those demanding consumers that force the Mexicans to say, hey, I can't keep producing lousy Volkswagen VWs. I'm producing something entirely different. It's not about trade diversion. It's all about trade creation. You gave us the opportunity, and now strategically we're going to take advantage.
Let me say something on that one, because this is almost a part of my personal history. I'm the son of refugees. So in Mexico, my parents came from Spain, and they came from a civil war, and we were always a very close family, not much money. And I used to be a bit jealous in school when a kid would take like a T-shirt that his father brought from the U.S. because I couldn't afford that. My parents didn't fly to the U.S. and buy clothes and so on. And in Mexico, we used to use the following term: export quality, which is the point you're making. When you think about that term, it's so grotesque because you are saying that you're going to produce better for the foreigners than for your own consumers. And that's what happens when you close your economy and you protect it, because you take advantage of the fact that the country is protected, and then you produce crummy Beetles, and you produce a very nice Jetta for American drivers or for Canadian drivers. So that's gone in Mexico. People still, when I give a speech in Mexico, I tell them, do you like the idea of export quality? And they say, sure, that's a great idea. Then I make them think. I say, what? You're thinking that we should produce better products for people abroad than domestically, which is a pretty wild idea when you think about it. But that has changed in Mexico dramatically. You are right. Our exports are not the crummy. We produce some Beetles in a wonderful plant in Puebla, but now we produce almost all the cars that are consumed in the U.S. The models that we send in the U.S. and in Mexico.
I would add to this as a side interest of mine. Almost certainly your price indexes don't account enough for the quality improvement of the goods. So the real wage gains may be even larger. Yeah. That's a big problem even in our price indexes. But I wanted to make a point and ask a question. The point was, I think I may have briefly alluded to earlier, an undergraduate honor student that wrote a thesis and won a prize on free trade agreements and so on, doing a gravity model examining different free trade agreements. And not nearly as sophisticated as Lorenzo's, but for those of you who don't think about it in all these terms, basic trade theory suggests that the bilateral trade should be a function of the product of the size of the economies and a decreasing function of the distance between them as a proxy for transportation costs. Hence the name gravity model. It looks a little bit like Newton's law of gravity. So he estimated these and looked at all the trade agreements. He was very interested also in trying to figure out what a Japan, China, Korea free trade agreement might be able to do. But looked at all the trade agreements and estimated them by looking at a gravity model estimated not only for the whole period, but at different periods, for the periods before and after the FTAs. And that he concluded that whatever you want to describe it, NAFTA conditional on GDP growth and all these problems Lorenzo was saying, what do we attribute, is it really just NAFTA? Increased trade by 84%. And that the effect of NAFTA was the largest of any of the trade agreements. So just FYI. The second is on this, getting at the diversion issue that Caroline's raising and that Kyle, you raised, kind of more recent trade theory. There's been, for those of you who don't follow this stuff, there's been a renaissance in trade theory. Ricardo's hot again, amongst other things, which is great from my perspective, intellectual historian. So you guys have developed these models which enable some notion of the orderings of comparative advantage. And it would seem to me you could be able to look into the details of that and even go beyond what Caroline's done and look at where the next lowest cost producers might have been and look at diversion there. And maybe that's a needle in a haystack, but just is that doable, do you think, Kyle?
Seems like it might be doable, yeah. I think we have the people in the room here, the empirical people who could do it. They're all nodding their heads, so I take reassurance in that.
Not only for which country, but actually which products.
Yeah, so it seems to me that may be the next kind of frontier of the academic research in this area that may profitably be pursued.
Please.
Make a point which might be blasphemy around this table, but to me the important message here, while the analyses that we've been talking about is important to understand some of these outcomes, we've got to go back to why Mexico went into the NAFTA negotiation. I mean, you weren't considering a whole lot about trade diversion or that. You had some basic goals which related to the structure of the Mexican economy and the transformation that you wanted to, under Salinas' government, start to move the economy and the whole structure of the country away from. We had the same sorts of things. They were different, but we had broad goals that we wanted to achieve by moving into a closer relationship with the United States and subsequently in the NAFTA with Mexico. And I think we've got to judge the success of NAFTA against how it responded and produced positive results against those two sets of criteria as to why we went into the deals. And yes, the various ingredients to support that are important, but we cannot lose sight of those broad reasons and the great success that we both achieved. The United States probably not to the same extent, but the fact that you've got two much healthier countries to your north and south is a very important part of the benefit that the United States achieved on this. And that, to me, I think is the message that we've got to take.
Great. Oh, please.
So, you showed us that the links between...
Diego, speak into the microphone, please.
There's no mic.
Oh, that's right. There's a.
Gotta speak up. Okay.
Just speak up. There's soft microphones around.
So you showed the links between U.S. and Mexico were high, and also the links between U.S. and Canada. But the links between Mexico and Canada were not so high, the trade links. So my question is, if you have a rough idea of how much of your quantified total gains could have been attained if, as opposed to signing a NAFTA, there would have just been signed two FTAs, one between U.S. and Mexico and the other one between U.S. and Canada?
It's a very good question, Diego. We haven't done that particular exercise, but what we did is the following. As I told you, many agreements were signed during this period. So using our methodology, we actually can feed into the model, into our methodology, all these agreements that were signed. And ask the following question. What if by the year 2005, which many agreements actually happened, all happened except NAFTA? So to what extent NAFTA helped Mexico, Canada, and the US to gain, given that they were also signing other agreements? And we find that actually the welfare measures are larger than what I show you today. So that's answering another question. It's not only NAFTA, it's like NAFTA potentially could help indirectly your benefits with other agreements. But we haven't done that particular exercise, which is very interesting, Diego. Since I'm talking, I would like to add what Dan is saying. This is one particular channel of the gains. That's exactly the key. We need a unifying way to measure all this. The particular objective functions of the governments which are negotiating, what are they after, what is their aim, in terms of that measure the gains in productivity, and other channels actually was Caroline saying. That's a unifying framework that we should be after as academics. And I guess all the incentives are aligned, and that's where actually we're going.
I'm speaking too much, but can I say something about Diego's question? I think that I've gone through this not intellectually or academically anymore, but what is better, three bilaterals or one trilateral? And the reason why I was asking myself this question is because a few years ago, Michael, your colleagues in Canada were pushing for more of a bilateral progress with the U.S. than injecting that energy to the trilateral agreement. So I started thinking, And I think there are many issues here that probably in Lorenzo's model you could simulate. First of all, there is an issue of scale of the market, which is not irrelevant. Second, there is an issue of logistics and innovation and exchange that is not irrelevant either. And if we do take the step of moving on the front of labor and letting the community develop, as George was saying, I think that allowing for a region to have free mobility of capital, free mobility of labor, and of course of merchandise, could add some welfare gains that are bigger than three bilaterals. But it will be an interesting exercise, and I assume your model can accommodate for that.
Please. Yes.
Sorry if you already answered this question, because I'm not an economist either, so sometimes I get a little lost in the diversion question. But if we agree that more free trade is good, and we agree that more access to inputs for producing is good, does it follow that, for example, if we took something like the Pacific Alliance, and would it be in the interest of NAFTA to say we want to change the rules of origin from, say, producers in the Pacific Alliance? And if you did, do you know what the Pacific Alliance is? And if you did that, then would that clearly be trade diversion, or would there be some reason why you should do that? Because I've been thinking a lot about how you make the trade area bigger and bigger, and since the WTO doesn't seem to be working in that, very well, I think that the Pacific Alliance is kind of a creative way to expand trade anyway in the countries in Latin America that are trying to liberalize more, as opposed to like the Bolivarian on the other side, which is more closed. But I don't know, maybe I'm just wondering, does something like that make any sense for the expansion of trade in the region, or is it too much, would it cause too much diversion?
Well, I want to couple that with the point made earlier about rules of origin, that they are really kind of a thorn in the side of all of this liberalization. And one thing is, in terms of the study we did, it shouldn't, our creation numbers should still go through, because to the extent that a margin is bigger, the rules of origin would be bigger, which would then come through in the estimates on the trade flows. So I don't think it would affect our estimates, but it probably reduces the, I don't know what the creation would be in the absence of the rules of origin, or especially with the or the diversion is because of them. But these are the ones with existing rules of origin. In terms of rules of origin, I guess the way the economists often deal with them as the group gets bigger is by accumulating them, which means that within the group, the local content just has to come from the group. And that's the discussion, for example, in the potential TPP. So it seems like as long as you accumulate them, so I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but as long as you accumulate the rules of origin, you're going to improve upon existing situation. But ideally, to discipline them in the WTO and have a standard, they can only be, a certain percentage, and that's it, would be the ideal way. I just wanted to also make another.
Accumulating rules of origin, is that?
Oh, that's.
I think that's the term, actually,
Yeah.
accumulation, but I
So what accumulation means is, like, if the rules of origin is 25% local content, it can come from this country or from another country in the agreement. So that's.
But does that mean that you could add, say you wanted to add Peru, you wanted to change the rules of origin for NAFTA for things that are coming from, say, the Pacific Alliance? Would that be in the interest of the NAFTA countries to do something like that, or would that be very diversionary?
Can I
Yeah,
answer
please.
that quickly? Well, first of all, I think that within the alliance, most of those countries already have free trade agreements with everybody, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but I think so it means that every single agreement they have a rule of origin. But the rule of origin applies to the specific agreement. So if I want to export this microphone, the steel has to come from North America, from Canada, from the US, or from Mexico. If we add Peru, the steel could come from Peru. That's the accumulation of the rule of origin. So I think that the US policymakers need to think, if they want to open up that possibility, taking into account what George was saying, that is for every dollar we export, 40 cents are American inputs, intermediate inputs. For the Peruvians, it's much lower. And from the rest of the Pacific Alliance, or for the TPP, it's much lower. So the consequence in the American industry or in the American economy is not minor. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, for people countries that want to export to the U.S. market, for us Mexicans would be fine to have the possibility to get an input from Peru if we find a very competitive input, and it's still qualified to export to the U.S. So that's the accumulation of the rules of origin.
It would have to be it would be opening up the possibility. So my instinct is it would have to be creationary. I don't see where, it's hard to see where a diversionary effect would come.
I don't know about that. No, you might be right. I just haven't thought that through.
Alan.
Related to this rules of origin discussion, one of the bits of lore among trade law practitioners is that a lot of NAFTA trade that could qualify for NAFTA preferences doesn't claim them because the transaction costs of claiming, approving compliance with the rules of origin actually exceeds the value of the preference. I was just curious if anyone has tried to get an empirical handle on what the magnitude of that problem is. And the related question is how much money is spent trying on the stuff that does get NAFTA treatment, how much money is spent proving compliance with NAFTA rules of origin.
Yeah.
Excellent point.
Caroline, do you?
There was a recent study done by some economists at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and they've overturned that result. So the old thinking was you needed a margin of 3% for people to take it, for trade to take advantage of preferences. But in looking at data at the very finely, like the 8 and 10 digit level instead of the 6-digit level, which is important because otherwise you're not measuring it correctly, they found that almost all margins are actually being taken advantage of. So it's really like a very small percentage of trade that's not taking advantage of preference margins.
I could add something. Alan and I were classmates at Yale back in the 70s. And we built, during the negotiation and before the final negotiation for rules of origin, a general equilibrium model for NAFTA. And we simulated different rules of origin. And we kept on comparing the rules of origin we were negotiating with Carla and with Michael. What effect would that have in the supply chain in Mexico? And most of the cases, we didn't have a big change. I mean, we didn't have big distortions. I think that now 89 or something percent or 90 plus percent of Mexican exports going into the U.S. comply with rules of origin. The methodology that is chosen to check that is happening is on a case-by-case demand. You know, people in Mexico say, well, you know, these guys from Illinois are exporting us this product and doesn't fulfill the rule of origin. So they go and they analyze it. The number of cases has been quite small, given the size of trade. Still, rules of origin are a pain. I agree.
Well, it affects, you also have to take into account that it affects small and medium-sized businesses disproportionately.
Yep.
So when you say 80 or 90% of trade, that is an accurate statement. But it is also an accurate statement to say many, many small and medium-sized businesses no longer take advantage of the NAFTA advantage because of the onerous cost and time involved in meeting those requirements.
Maybe one last comment. Oh, I'm sorry, please finish.
Well, and because in the United States, small and medium-sized enterprises are the job creators, you really pinch the foot that's running in the race.
One last comment.
A question to Lorenzo.
showed this very quickly, but I think if I saw it correctly, you did find a welfare effect in the auto industry in the U.S. So I wanted to know a little bit about what produces that result. That's primarily driven by the intermediate goods methodology that you're following, because it really runs so much counter to all the things about Detroit and the decline of U.S. industry, automobile. So it just struck me as a very odd finding, and I wanted to know a little bit about it.
Yes, exactly. But it was in particular more for Canada than to the US. So that's the conclusion. No, so it's for Canada. It was positive for all, but the main for the US, the main sectors were textiles and electrical machinery. Electrical machinery basically involves machineries in general, which are used as intermediate good, and most of those goods are actually exported to Mexico. So that was the main driver. But autos was in particular for Canada. Not for, so that was them.
I'm going to suggest we take a 15-minute break now. I think we probably all could use it. And we'll reconvene looking more to the future with energy and then kind of a more general discussion about the NAFTA and its implications for the future of trade liberalization.